Welcome back. You're listening to the Carbon series by Rethinking Climate. This is the second episode, and we are investigating the carbon debate, looking at carbon footprint calculators and carbon offsets through interviews of some organizations from this field of work. In the first episode, we looked at what are carbon calculators, while in this episode, we will look at how they are made and how they communicate what they do. So if you missed the first episode, you can find it in the description.
So when we talked with Kai from Myclimate, I asked him a question about what's best communicated and how best you can communicate sustainability, because I've recently read a book and the authors believe that the sustainability and communication sustainability is actually failing. So because experts in the field of communicating sustainability sort of have been struggling, I recently read a book that sort of came up as a reason because the authors who are experts in the field thought that the reason why improving sustainability is slow, it's because communicating sustainability is failing. What do you think of this?
For me, this argument sounds a bit too simple. Because we are talking about such a big issue, and it's a systemic issue. So there's no silver bullet outside. So hey, if we would have communicated a bit better the last 10 years, so yeah, we would be much closer to our target. I don't think so. You can always improve your communications, but you can always improve your financial support for climate action. You can always improve your scientific efforts, and you can always improve your regulations. It's a question of personal behavior and a systemic question about, let's say, global industries. So the problem is huge and a systemic one, and we have to work and to fight on different edges. And that this is more important. So yeah, if you find a way to communicate better, do this, and this is absolutely fine, but this is not the silver bullet from my perspective.
Saying that the communication on itself, of course, it's not allowed, it's not enough to change the system, but it helps people to figure out and to become more aware and conscious about their responsibility and the potential that they have with their actions.
Yes, indeed. So communication is essential because the basic of media theory teaches you that also when you see something, it symbolizes something else in your mind. So I think a very good example is when you study it, media theory, and they sort of give you the cat image and then the sort of symbolism of the letters C-A-T, and you understand that that identifies a cat. But what's cat in my head would not be the same cat in your minds. And that's sort of also the same reasoning I think we must remind ourselves when we're writing about sustainability, whatever specific topic we're touching upon that relates to sustainability or climate change. It's the terminology and how that also reflects in someone else's mind. So again, polluting and CO2, energy consumption, energy use, all of these terms, of course, have a very specific meaning. But if you have a website like Myclimate, for instance, I believe it's very important to sort of comprehend the use that has been made also in other media platforms about that term.
So when we're talking about carbon footprint calculators as a communication tool, I guess we're sort of discussing how do we get to people's hearts in order to make them change their behaviors, because they can read all of these scary statistics about climate change and behavior, but communication is the thing that will either make someone change their behavior or not. I think Aurora Sustainability has quite an interesting approach to it because of how accessible they've made their quiz. And so they use what they call the Aurora score, which Danny discusses further, which takes carbon emissions from something intangible like CO2 equivalent into the score which people can then compare to others, compare to their own country, improve on, see what it means in terms of their own behaviors. And it's an interesting communication tool because of the accessibility. And so Danny elaborates on this idea.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that for an individual, obviously people who are very interested in sustainability and CO2, you know, when you tell them how many kilograms of CO2 that they're emitting, it's interesting. But for the average person, I think kilograms of CO2 is not necessarily a very tangible measure. You know, we know that on average you should be emitting 44 kilograms of CO2 to reduce the 2% increase in temperature. But what does that actually mean? And so something that we've also found really important on top of the scientific verification aspect is making it real. So you'll see on our dashboard, for instance, we compare that to loads of washing. We also have the Aurora score out of 100. We also do a lot of comparison work. So you can compare to the average South African to see how you're doing. So I think as well as the scientific aspect, the making something real and tangible, I think is just as important.
I agree. And I think it's also great that there are options out there now. You can sort of choose what type of calculator might fit you best. And I guess we as a group at Rethinking Climate are very much looking at how do we communicate the issue of sustainability better to help people change their behavior. So how do you think, I think you've touched on it a bit, but how do you think a carbon footprint calculator works as a communication tool to help people understand their impact and hopefully change it?
So I think for us, awareness is the most important thing. Once you're aware of the impact of your actions, you can't continue blindly causing damage. We've seen it ourselves just because we've heard stories of people who have gone vegan because, you know, you kind of hear, okay, meat's bad for the environment or whatever, but quantifying that impact and seeing what a difference it makes tangibly when you do make a change like that has really been how we've seen the impact being made. And making people aware of the impact is really, I think, one of the most important contributors to moving forward in terms of climate action. Because once you're aware that you individually can make an impact, you start to see people seeing where else they can improve that impact. So, you know, for instance, in a company, if you are able to show people that there are better ways to do things, they sort of start to make small changes, and those changes create big changes when there's a lot of people doing them. And so that's where we see our carbon footprint calculator being more than just telling people their CO2. It's about awareness. It's about showing people that they can make an individual impact, and that small changes at a large scale are actually really important.
And I think you've again touched on it, but you've chosen an approach through your branding and your marketing and how you show the score that's quite fun and it's a lot more accessible. What goes into that choice as a communication tool to make it more fun and easy to interact with? Have you seen a good response to that in terms of people understanding their impact and then changing their behavior? And what's the response been so far?
Absolutely. So we love to use sort of some humor. So we use a lot of GIFs, a lot of memes, and I think that makes it really accessible. So we've worked with a few influencers and tracked their realistic sustainability journeys, and had a lot of, for instance, you've used channels like Instagram Live to really engage people, and it really is a very human approach. I think obviously there is the science behind it, and that's incredibly important, but accessibility has always been a key aspect for us in our brand strategy, and helping people to realize that it's not as overwhelming as you may think. I think becoming sustainable can be overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of jargon. a lot of sort of confusing opinions. And so what we really wanted to do was make it accessible, make it fun, make it something that people want to talk about, instead of it being something that's overwhelming or depressing or something like that.
So I really liked how she mentions that there's a lot of overflow of information, overcrowded information. That's something that a lot of governments, especially even the European Union, has been talking. They just too much online. The way we also manage digital citizenship and digital as a tool and support to our understanding. So it's again interesting how accessibility comes from an idea of how to also, we can say, translate that amount of technical information into something that people can comprehend with a jargon that it's still related to the topic itself. So Aurora Sustainability provides a calculator that therefore means that the terminology they use in the calculator is related to that sort of field, and it's probably even partially educating, because more you read about it, the more you understand what that relates into. So I thought that it was really interesting to hear her point that out. So this is actually something that we've asked to Kai from Myclimate. So what was the basic principles behind the calculators? Because what we were trying to figure out is also the reasoning, not just the calculator as a scientific expression that needs, of course, to exist, otherwise you can't really calculate, but sort of the mentality and mission that comes from behind the actual creation of the whole calculator and the organization per se. So for instance, with Myclimate, there are a group of also of consultants, so companies can go to them and say, hey, I really would like to improve my own sustainability index, we can call it like that. Could you help me as experts? And so calculation in the sense is for the user, as well as an understanding and connection that sort of it's expressed in a different way, of course, more professionally, more detailed for a company. And so that's, Kai explains a little bit the whole reasoning behind quite briefly. And what do you think should be the basic principles behind the calculators?
The basic principle, it's depending on the specific calculators. So if you talk about a mobility calculator, like a calculator for flight travel, yeah, then of course it's about the kerosene. But I think for this specific calculator, it's very important that you also take the other impacts on the climate into account. It's so-called the RFI factor, so radiation force index. So this means the aerosol, so everything what's happening in the higher parts of our atmosphere, which have also an impact on the climate. So this is very important. If you find a flight calculator which has no RFI factors, so it's only covering the carbon footprint, which is okay, but to get a better result, so you have to look to the RFI factor. If you choose your footprint calculator, then I think this one has to cover mobility, flying, and also, let's say, car transport, but also very important, food, heating, and electricity, and consumption.
What kind of companies have decided to approach Myclimate services?
Oh, these are different companies, different in terms of the industry, but also different in terms of sizes. So we have small and medium enterprises, as well as globally acting companies and corporations taking advantage of our services. So you cannot really point, let's say, one industry. We have, of course, some industries who are more sensitized on these issues, like the travel and tourism industries, the mobility and transportation industry, as well as the printing industries. But it would also work for service providers and for production companies.
What do you think motivates mostly these companies who then resolve to go to Myclimate for your services?
So usually you have three types of motivations. So you have the early adapters, or the people with a strong intrinsic motivation, say, I want to do something good for the environment and for the society, and I want to take on responsibility for my footprint. So this is very strong motivation for some. But then it's another motivation. It's more, let's say, kind of communication or even marketing related. So people saying, hey, we claim that we are a green brand, that we are offering green products with a considerably low carbon footprint, and we want to also take on responsibility for it being kind of a global or local citizen. So we definitely need to provide information about on our footprint, and we also need to communicate our efforts to become a green company. So that is the, let's say, the second motivation. And the third motivation is there are some companies who are obliged to take on these services, who need or to report their CO2 footprint because the regulator is claiming that. So, and most of the time, it's a mix of all these three, or let's say of the, at least of the first two motivations.
So here, Kai from Myclimate has commented very well on the importance of including a variety of different areas within the carbon calculation. But within a calculation, I think some people assume that because it's mathematics, we have to find it reliable. Whereas a calculation always includes some factors and leaves out others. So it's important to also look at some areas which may have been left out of a lot of calculators. And just one that I think is important to touch on, especially because we're a digital platform and it forms part of our own carbon footprint, is the impact of digital media, our digital devices, and the fact that maybe the move to being more online isn't always better for the environment. I think this relates to an earlier interview that Asia did with Antonio Lopez, who discusses the carbon impact of the lifetime of our digital devices and how the huge amount of data we're consuming and processing has a carbon impact, even though we think of it as this magical thing that floats around somewhere in the air. It isn't. Data is stored somewhere and it has an impact.
It sounds very absurd, the whole concept that we cannot use media instead because it reaches so many people in a way that could actually convert this conversation to something that can bring results. So what is now what is wrong in the argument? I mean, I had an expert once say, well, as you notice, changes has to come from the people, because often when people push for something to change, for instance, the food, now some products have the no palm oil written on top, and then people think that they're environmental because they're buying a bag of plastic with some food in it, but there's no palm. Come on, you're not hurting anyone. But it's something happening there. So what is not going well in the conversation we're bringing forward to a should still understand that something's happening?
Well, one of the problems, first of all, when you talk about eco-media, you talk about the environmental impact of our technologies, it creates kind of a problem of hypocrisy in the sense that, well, I'm still using these computers, even though I know they're very damaging to the environment. I still use phones, although I have to say I do have a fair phone, which is a better phone than a normal one. But and my answer is that, first of all, you have to use what's available. I mean, you can't start from zero. We already have a communication system in place, and I'm not. So I wanted to actually. This is related to what I was saying before, which is there's a strain of environmental thinking which is very anti-technology, which actually drives people away from environmentalism because they feel like people don't really want to change their lifestyle. So So there has to be a little bit of a compromise in the sense that people need to understand when you're advocating for the environment, it doesn't mean you have to become like go live in a cave or go live on a farm. I mean, but we do have to make changes. The thing is that the changes, if you look at the big corporations like BP, the big fossil fuel companies, they're all for people being environmentally conscious on an individual level because it means they don't have to do anything. So they even advocate these ideas of being like, consumer conscious and, buy green stuff, because the more you do that, the less they have to change. So what really has to happen is probably a little bit of a combination of we do have to adjust our lifestyle somewhat. I mean, we do have power as consumers. Like, for example, in order to change these media technologies, we have to advocate to the technology companies to change their practices. On the other hand, we need laws. We need rules that say you can't use conflict minerals. We need rules that say the companies have to buy back or they have to take back their old technology. If they had to do that, they would change their practices in a minute. So there has to be kind of a mix between sort of the so-called lifestyle politics and then also actual structural change. But as I've been saying throughout, ultimately it's this issue of eco-justice, which the more you look at it, it just comes down to inequality, because the top 10% of the people in the economy are producing 50% of the CO2. So actually, let me bring in another discussion point, which is the idea of the Anthropocene, because people are using this term sort of uncritically all over the place. Every time they think I'm going to do something environmental, I'm going to call it the Anthropocene. But the problem with the term Anthropocene is that it focuses on the results and the causes of environmental problems as if it was inherently a human caused problem, but it's a structural problem. It's like, oh yeah, men will be men. That's why we have all this environmental damage. But it's not human nature. It's structural. It has to do with the system that we have. So we have to also, push back against, deconstruct, and argue against the way that people are also framing the problem. So again, this idea, I think what you were referring to before was this idea of greenwashing, like we just tweak a little thing in our product, we put the word natural, or we have sort of some pseudo concept of organic and somehow it makes it better. Okay, that's fine for, it has maybe a minor impact in a very small way, but it doesn't substitute for real structural change.
So far, we've touched a bit more on carbon footprints and how they work in terms of individuals. Daniel from Ecosphere talks a bit more about the communication method towards organizations and the importance of organizations taking responsibility for their carbon impact. Because as we said in the first episode, individuals cannot take the full blame for climate change as a result of carbon emissions. So Daniel talks about how important it is for companies and organizations to really interrogate which part of their businesses are polluting the most and how to reduce those, because reduction is always important before they offset their emissions. Great. And I think part of what we want to do as a group is figure out how best to communicate the issue of sustainability and the issue of climate change. And so what role do you think this sort of calculator plays as a communication tool for either individuals or businesses?
Yeah, I think I've kind of raised a little bit already in that you can't really begin to fix what you haven't measured, and so everybody from an individual to a company to a government should kind of, I guess, know their carbon footprint, and a bit like an LCA of a product. You take into account the life cycle analysis. Okay, whereabouts in this value chain is the worst? The worst of it being done. Where's the biggest carbon footprint? At that point, you can be like, okay, that's where I can fix it. And actually, once I and once you and once a company can find that carbon footprint, and you go, okay, actually, we're flying way too much. Okay, that's where we need to put the biggest that's where we need to put the biggest effort there. And actually look into what's the biggest material impact of your carbon footprint and of your value chain, and say, okay, this is what we need to put into the sustainability program. And so, by being able to measure a carbon footprint and see actually where your carbon footprint comes from, you can put your biggest focus into the areas where it's needed, as opposed to maybe spending way too much time or a disproportionate amount of time or something that actually maybe your carbon footprint is really good in. I don't know, your paper supply or your commuting, maybe you all work from home, which everyone does now.
So in the first episode, we discussed a bit more about what a carbon footprint calculator is and discussed a little about how it is calculated. But I think part of that, which relates more to the communication role of the calculator, is the fact that in order to believe what these people are communicating and that the information in the calculators is accurate, the calculators need to be transparent about their methodology and show their verification protocols. Daniel discussed in depth about how they verify their carbon footprint calculator and the fact that it's actually outsourced to a company which does carbon footprinting and is an expert in that field. But I think we need in a world where there's so much fake news going around, transparency and accountability is so important. And especially if you're going to be paying money to a project which is doing offsets, you need to know that you can trust them.
Part of it, in terms of as individuals and as people who aren't qualified to do the calculations ourselves, so much of it is trusting in the companies who we are going to support.
Yeah.
And I think you touched on a little bit earlier, but what is the process of verification of these projects to ensure that what people are paying for is actually happening?
Yeah, no, and that's completely fair, and actually it does come down to trust, and that's kind of something that we're really pushing for in the market, is that we need there to be utmost transparency, because people don't trust what isn't transparent, right? So we're really advocating for transparency on pricing. We're advocating for transparency on methodologies of projects, and if you buy a carbon from projects and you say I want to see it, like, we will organise a site visit because we want people to go and see that it's so much more than carbon. Carbon is the tip of the iceberg.
I really like how Daniel puts it, the fact that carbon, it is the point of the iceberg, because the communication part of sustainability, or sustainability in general, it's quite a wide range of many factors just that play a role quite essential in how we see our planet going for the future. And again, what role we personally have as business owners, maybe as individuals, as students, as citizens, as experts or non-experts. So it is very much good what he's saying, and I think he opens quite a large range of further conversation when it comes to transparency, which I think it's something that we maybe don't take in consideration too much.
Yes, and also it's really important to be reliable when you do such a project, and to try to convince people to commit to reduce their carbon footprint and to do their job to fight climate change. So this was all for the second episode. For more background information, you can find the link in the description. And that's all. So you listen to the Carbon series by Rethinking Climate. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So stay tuned for the next episode.